Well, good afternoon. My name is Bill Cooper. I am a pediatrician and epidemiologist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, Tennessee. And we are about to commit a false dichotomy. So, Leslie, I don't know if you ran across a sign for false dichotomy. We're going to pretend like we just talked about the regulatory barriers. And now our session is going to focus on the liability barriers. Anybody who thinks about this gets that those are so inextricably linked you can't even think about it, right? What we wanted to do was to spend this part of the session really talking about the real and perceived liability concerns that people at the front line of this work often will face. Clinicians, IRB members, industry, those who sort of spend that time, because the perception of liability, as we've heard all day, is really important. But we wanted to spend this session really talking a little bit about that with hopes that as we move to the rest of this afternoon and then tomorrow, we can begin to say, okay, now how do we then navigate this? And so we're going to spend time talking a little bit about that. So that's a little bit about that. And so as you prepare for this session, think about all the ways that the 200 people online and the 50 people in this room interface with the things we're talking about today. And how, in my role as a husband of a pregnant person who took medications during pregnancy, I had to deal with those perceptions. As a pediatrician, I take care of children and recently pregnant people, and I think about drugs and lactation. And as a researcher, I enroll pregnant persons in trials of opioid use. A lot of stigma and liability risks concerned there. And as I sat on the Vanderbilt IRB for 10 years, we were driven by I totally admit this, we were driven by prove to us that this needs to happen. And I don't even know what the liability concern was. We just were fearful of something. I can't even tell you what that was. And so in order to sort of continue to move the needle, that's what we're going to focus on during our time. So the good news is that because I have all those roles, you could call me a jack of all trades, but an expert in none. So we've got some real experts here who will help us walk through some of the concerns. So immediately to my side over here, we've got Carmen Zaria, who is professor of obstetrics and gynecology at University of Puerto Rico. Then we've got Jessica Cohen, who is the director of the Office of Research Affairs at PATH, and then Aviva Wine, who is assistant general counsel at Johnson & Johnson. Their full bios are on page 24 of your speakers information, and so I'll refer you to that. But I just wanted to have them tell us their story, and then our conversation before we bring back Mega Panel, which will be both groups, is to really have us think about first, what are some of those things, and then we'll start moving into how we think about the steps forward. So, Carmen, tell us a little bit about your perspective on this.
Hi, thanks for giving me this opportunity. If we can have the next slide. I have to say that I'm fortunate in a sense that I've been working for the past 35 years in the HIV world. So I started working with pregnant women then, pregnant persons, living with HIV when there were no treatments. And we've moved all the treatments to the point where it is considered chronic transmission. And my strategy for getting funds for women were to focus on the children because everybody wanted, to protect the children. So that was my personal strategy. If you want to have a child, you have a pregnant person beforehand. So let's do the composite or whatever. So in terms of perceived sources of risks for pregnancy, I should say that as a practicing OBGYN, drug discontinuation is one of the things that we usually see when pregnancy is diagnosed. Our patients discontinue their drugs because they think that anything and everything is harmful in pregnancy. And then we have mentioned here before that not taking that drug is probably more harmful than taking it. Most drugs are really safe, most of them. So, and this requires a conversation. Again, as a provider, when you don't have that much information on that specific drug, but you know the mechanisms of transmembrane transport of substances, and if it's a small molecule or a large molecule, you can actually predict whether it would cross the placenta, and you can actually say, well, this is a large molecule. It's very unlikely that this drug might cross the placenta and get to the fetus. So that also helps in guiding that conversation. Another one is concerns when prescribing new drugs during pregnancy because of lack of knowledge, same thing. And again, this might affect adherence. So if you don't have that conversation with your patient and she's not on board, she will take the prescription home and it will be sitting there. And then you will be managing her complications, assuming that she was taking this medication or this treatment that you were prescribing. The other issue is lack of concern or knowledge on the safety of over-the-counter drugs and the drug interactions. Let's have the next one. Oh, I have. The liability concerns also the cost containment. For example, in Puerto Rico, when we want to prescribe insulin and labetalol to pregnant persons who have diabetes or hypertension, insurance will not cover it because the prescription doesn't come from an endocrinologist or a cardiologist. And we have such people in the team, but sometimes we know more about diabetes in pregnancy than probably some endocrinologists. So this is an issue. It's not happening in other states, but it's happening in ours. Next one. Databases are great, and I think we need to move more into databases. And one good example is the Pregnancy Drug Registry for HIV drugs, because it is completed by the provider and it's prospective. When you have databases that are completed by patients, you might have misinterpretation and biases. And I have a friend of mine who looked to the vaccine adverse event website, and he found gonorrhea as a side effect of a COVID vaccine. So you tell me. Nevertheless, I think these are useful websites and information that we need to have. Next one. Again, public campaigns are important, and I believe that most people here and in our community know about the issues related to cigarette smoking in pregnancy and to alcohol use in pregnancy. And I think we've been very successful transmitting that information. We maybe need to focus on keeping the pre-pregnancy health or the reproductive health planning, or whatever terms we want to use. It's optimization of pre-pregnancy health. Next one. One example of information, and the last one, next one. So again, it was mentioned, I am not an expert, I'm a practicing clinician, also a researcher. I think we need to have these mitigation strategies, injury compensation programs. The more data we have, the more data that we can share with providers, with insurance, with patients and community and people who might be thinking on lawsuits. If the data is there, maybe we might not have those issues, and the safety data should be available. Next one, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the organizers for having me. I thought I would just briefly give a second of background about PATH to help contextualize my comments. So PATH is a global health nonprofit organization whose mission is to advance health equity through innovation and partnerships. And we do this through work in 5 core areas, and these are vaccines, diagnostics, drugs, devices, and health systems. So our human subjects research and our clinical trials specifically are a core part of how we advance these health interventions. So our current research portfolio is about 100 open studies being conducted across over 35 countries around the world, and about a quarter of these are vaccine clinical trials. So for my remarks, I'll just briefly comment on liability concerns from a research perspective, drawing on the experience and inputs from my colleagues across our various divisions, including legal, our Office of Research Affairs, and our vaccine and essential medicines. So to begin with, certainly the questions around regulatory requirements. What will regulatory bodies accept or require as sufficient and necessary data to advance product development for use in pregnant women? So what are the necessary stepwise trials, including evaluation of different dosing regimens and inclusion of different non-pregnant populations to lead to research with pregnant women? A financial component. Will funders and donors support the necessary costs and timelines associated with this expanded regulatory pathway? Participant safety. Is there an adequate evidence base to feel confident and comfortable with assuming an investigator role on a study that will investigate the product in these populations? I think, as others have mentioned, there's an evolving understanding of what are the appropriate animal models to use for the developmental and reproductive toxicology studies, and which provides the best models for demonstrating safety. Further, managing injury and adverse events. So, of course, as many have talked about, how to manage claims that could result from an adverse outcome for the mother or child. And this may certainly differ based on the setting where the research is being conducted. So understanding the statutory requirements and timeframes for bringing claims in a specific setting and how this will impact the investigator and the institutional responsibilities, budgets, insurance requirements as well, including how long after a study ends does the insurance tail remain for claims that might result from the intervention with the pregnant person. Partnership complexity. This has been touched on as well. In large multi-stakeholder research partnerships, of which we are part of many, there are added complexities due to the network of partners, stakeholders, and funders that each bring their own values and norms and risk thresholds and perspectives, and that requires time for alignment. Reputational risk. If problems do occur, what are the reputational risks that can result with a study involving pregnant or lactating persons? So even if they're no longer considered a vulnerable population by regulation, there may be heightened sensitivity to the research with these populations that can vary widely depending on the research context. And then the perception of the ethical challenges and complexities. I think, as this has been mentioned several times this morning, as Maggie noted as well, I think that we're still operating under this chilling effect from years of labeling pregnant women as vulnerable populations, and the perception that these studies will intrinsically be more complex, invite challenges or delays from reviewing IRBs, and trigger higher ethical hurdles, if you will. So although the regulations have been updated, I think this perception still lingers and certainly needs to be addressed. And then the timeline for sponsor or researcher liability. So when does that liability end? So in research with pregnant or lactating persons, there's of course always the dyad of the mother and child to consider, as well as possible third parties if you consider the impacts on mother's milk and implications if she's a milk donor and her milk is being consumed by other possibly vulnerable infants. So understanding the possible long-term safety impacts of research interventions is critical, as is the associated liabilities that could arise from the study, from long-term impacts from these interventions. And then lastly, touching on just some of the broader risks in the research environment, as is the safety surveillance systems, especially in many low and middle income countries, systems for capturing AEs and outcomes related to maternal or any vaccines are limited, which make it difficult to track outcomes that could be associated with vaccinations. And the lack of standardized data measures to track and record these outcomes is also a challenge, as it limits the comparison of data between geographies, and in case of those rare events, limits our understanding of the baseline issues that were in place prior to a new vaccine introduction, and a number of uncertainties related to coverage under the Vaccine Compensation Injury Program that impact liability concerns from a vaccine R&D perspective, including what vaccines are covered and how eligibility is determined. So I'll close with those, and then we'll be happy to comment on how PATH addresses some of these in the Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone. Aviva Ween. I am Assistant General Counsel at Johnson & Johnson, but I lead a group at J&J called Litigation Policy and Risk Management. And for about the last decade, have been managing product liability litigation across all of our sectors at J&J. So I come at this from a very different perspective that I hope to share with you. When we think about the issue of real and perceived liability of including pregnant and lactating people in clinical trials, I think what's really important is not to lose sight of what should be driving the decision-making in this space. And Pharmaceutical companies develop, manufacture, sell products, all with the hope that they will help people change the course of a disease, prevent another disease, change a life, and maybe even save a life. And in the clinical trial context, the primary concern is to protect the subjects, protect the patients, take informed and necessary risks to get the data that you need to get a product to market so that healthcare providers can make informed decisions for their patients, right? And that, of course, includes pregnant and lactating people. An important consideration, though, is not to delay or prevent availability of those products to market. And that's just the truth of it, right? And I don't think it would be fair to say that a manufacturer hesitates to include a population of pregnant and lactating people in a trial solely because of liability risk. I just don't think that's the truth. I think getting the product into the hands of those who need it expeditiously, right, is the most important thing, and adding complex populations to those trials is a consideration. But that isn't to say that liability risk doesn't exist, isn't real, and isn't a consideration, because it is. And it's a consideration in pre- and post-clinical, post-approved contexts. So I think, but to fully understand the real and perceived liability associated with pregnant and lactating people, it's really important to first understand the landscape in which we operate in the United States when it comes to liability. It's quite frankly, I'm not sure many people have appreciation for that full landscape. So let me give you a little bit of history. So before 2007, what was really common was for liability litigation to begin only after FDA took some kind of action, analyzed the safety issue, maybe recalled a product, or determined there should be a label change. And there usually was some media attention to that, and liability litigation followed. But in the last 12 years, that's really changed. And that's changed because safety concerns based on big data sources or social media have even prompted litigation before FDA's even acted. And in some instances, adverse events that have been prompted by actual litigation actually is what triggers regulatory scrutiny. But as a result of all of this, there's an avalanche of claims in liability litigation in the US that are getting started based on weaker evidence, and that's just the truth of it. And before the agency that's entrusted with protecting the public and public health has had a chance to weigh in on those safety concerns. And liability litigation in the US doesn't even need a trigger anymore, right? At bottom, all that's necessary is a product that has a decent sized market and something to attract lawyers to it. And why is that, right? Why is that here in the United States, which is very different than anywhere in the rest of the world? It's because mass tort liability litigation is a huge business in the US, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar business to plaintiff lawyers. It's not this sort of obsolete image that people have of a besieged lawyer who's championing the cause of an allegedly, downtrodden. Rather, this is really big business funded by hedge funds, private equity, and other private investors. And their aim is to get as many claims as possible to extract as big a possible settlement from companies as possible. And of course, they do this by advertising. And I'm sure all of you have sat in your hotel rooms last night, watched some television, and 5 minutes goes by and you see an advertisement for a lawyer. It's become so pervasive that it's really hard to go more than one commercial break or more than 5 minutes on Facebook without seeing one of those ads. And I think earlier Dr. Haas said something like it would be great if you saw these ads on Channel 6 that said protect people through research. But that's not what we see on television, right? We see sue manufacturers, sue doctors for your alleged injury. And those people who respond, right, they become part of an inventory of cases that are passed from lawyer to lawyer, which results in just a huge litigation process. And most importantly, in this entire process, in this ecosystem of litigation, the arbiter of safety and efficacy in this space, the FDA, is irrelevant, right? Irrelevant in the courtroom, irrelevant to the plaintiff lawyers. So when we talk about real and perceived liability for this particular population, you have to understand that this doesn't exist in a barren landscape that lacks interest or real exposure. There is real exposure. And this will just be, and already is, another fertile area for plaintiff lawyers to expand their business model. So it's not a question of real and perceived. It's all real, right? It's a question of magnitude, it's a question of risk tolerance, and it's a question of risk mitigation. And so I think moving into this area will require all parties, right, to confront their fears of liability for injuries to pregnant and lactating people, to the fetus, but in the context of this very litigious society. And I think those things that we have to confront are things like assessing long-tail liability, right? So not just injury to the mother, injury to the fetus, but injury to the resulting individual, right, 18 years later, where they still can sue the manufacturer. I think you need to think about the magnitude of harm to the fetus, right, or the offspring. And then very importantly, the liability profile of the enterprise is important. So some enterprises may have much more risk tolerance, right? Others may be so risk averse because liability is something they avoid at all costs and they're not used to dealing with it. But I think what's really important is putting those liability concerns in the right standing in the hierarchy of reasons to limit participation of this population in these trials. I think there are potential risk mitigation actions, there are incentives that can help companies face into the risk, and I'm sure we'll cover some of those today. That's it.
Great. So we've had a chance to hear the perspective from a clinician, from somebody who sits in the research space and somebody who sits at the sort of in industry, and it really is in often ways, and sort of dovetailing to the conversation for the previous group. It is a little bit about reframing, recognizing that there are risks and that there's some regulatory, and we'll continue to focus on the liability side for this session until we bring the other panelists back. But I'd love to hear from your all's perspective. As we begin to think about steps forward, what are some of the lower hanging fruit from your perspective? Because I think as we've seen, those who've been at this for a long time are saying, we're making some good progress. I have heard from some who are newer to this space. They're like, oh my gosh, why are we still talking about this? Ruth told us that it's been years and years. But as we continue to move forward, what are some of the strategies from each of your perspectives that you see as ways that we might start moving forward? I know, Jessica, you sort of had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can comment briefly just on kind of how PATH looks at this from an institutional perspective. So kind of on an institutional, I'd say research oversight framework, there are a number of policies and processes that we have in place to kind of mitigate or minimize these risks. So certainly starting with scientific merit review and the requirement that, there's sound scientific rationale for the inclusion and exclusion for study populations. We're in the process of actually developing new research guidance, which highlights factors associated with equity and justice in research, calling out that populations like pregnant women should not be unfairly excluded without sound scientific rationale. We have a policy on study-related injuries, certainly that applies to all of our clinical trials and investigational products, that requires that there's appropriate liability insurance and a plan for treatment of study-related injuries, and that explains how that medical care will be provided and paid out. Our consent forms, we have a lot of guidance around what needs to be in consent forms, certainly information related to study-related injuries, but not in legalese, but really clear so that participants understand where to go in the event of a related injury, and multiple measures to ensure that information is comprehensible from a reading level and understanding level. We also have a requirement for crisis communication plans for all of our studies that are greater than minimal risk. And this is to ensure that there is a coordinated plan that's in place a priori to address real or perceived concerns coming from a study. We also require IRB review in the country where the research is taking place to ensure that local regulatory requirements and that risk-benefit analysis grounded in the local context is being addressed. And then just briefly from a legal and insurance perspective, PATH holds a policy that covers all of our human subjects research versus separate insurance for distinct trials. And we've tailored our coverage to remove limitations relating to birth control, pregnancy, or human subjects research. This applies on a worldwide basis with the ability to include locally admitted policies via this master program. And this includes no-fault medical payment coverage as well, which can respond in the event of an injury.
Really, really nice. Lots of very practical solutions. Some of them very similar to the things that Anna was describing. Really nice. So, Aviva, from your perspective, when you think about industry, what are some proactive steps? And I know that as you interface with your colleagues throughout the organization, there's times where these questions come up about that. What do you think are ways that we might sort of move past the perceived risks and really get to the handle on the real ones?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing and the thing that should be driving everybody is what's best for the patient, right? And who that patient population is. And so and of course, as our speakers before said, the remarks that I make here are my own, not those of J&J, but I think that pushing past this idea that liability risk is so scary that you can't touch it, right? We live in a world of liability risk. This is just another area of risk. Yes, it is a much more emotional area of risk, right? And so that, I think, gives it this imprimatur of greater risk, but it is just another area of risk. And understanding that we can create risk mitigation strategies, along that continuum, just like we do in the course of a regular clinical development program, and not being put off by the simple statement, this is a pregnant and lactating person. I think the idea that was mentioned earlier, people are people, right? Risk is risk, right? You just have to learn how to live with it, how to mitigate, and to understand that, look, we live in a world of risk, and it just is a matter of understanding what you're getting into and understanding what you're going to get out of it.
That's a really important point. Now, Carmen, I'm going to turn to you for just a second. As a pediatrician, I want people to play well together. So one of the things I want to have our panel do is we often see that we operate within silos, right? So the researchers sit over here, and the IRB sits here, and the industry sits here, and clinicians sit. Carmen, and each of you, I'll turn to each of you. This is, what do you wish that Jessica in her regulatory affairs and Aviva in her legal advice realm, what do you wish she knew about the things you face as a clinician? And I'll turn to each of you with the same question. So, Carmen, you first.
Well, I wish they would know a lot of things, but I think moving into what we're living right now with misinformation and disinformation, I think I would love to have some help from regulatory, from somebody to help me actually even to have to upgrade my treatment consent forms for regular treatment at the hospital, for prescription of drugs that we use on a regular basis. And we might end up having consents like the ones like what we use for research, which are 20 pages, 30 pages. But somehow we need to make sure that we cross that bridge of misinterpretation, misunderstanding, disinformation, which is so prevalent right now, and our patients are finding all kinds of, I'm going to use a word that I shouldn't, but anyway, crazy ideas in terms of what health is and what treatments are.
Thank you, Karen. So Jessica, what do you wish clinicians and people who give us legal direction and advice, what do you wish they would know about what you bring to the table so that we could work better together out of our silos?
I think from a research, kind of the research oversight perspective, I think the understanding that we're all, working on this together, right? And so I think we have common goals that we're not, the opportunities to align. And I think that's where the research development pathway can really start. If we're sitting and thinking about a new product development pathway together, and so from the outset, working with our legal colleagues, our clinicians, our researchers, our funders, sitting down with regulators. So having that discussion early on with all the invested stakeholders, and I think is really critical for making sure we're aligned on a pathway.
Yeah, a lot about sort of that alignment and recognizing common interests. I think some of the language we're hearing, because I've already learned a ton just being here and being on the planning committee about how to think about these things in a slightly different frame. So Viva, what do you wish we would all know?
That lawyers are here to be partners with you. I think that there's a perception that lawyers are here to say no, but that isn't the case, right? We're here to help move science forward, at least in industry, and to help do what's best for patients in the most safe and efficacious way, and that we're here to tell you maybe not path 1A, but maybe path 1B, right, to help you along that continuum.
Really great. Well, I want to thank our panelists. Really great. Really nice perspective and helping us begin to think as we move forward. So we're going to do something very exciting. We're going to have mega panel, right? So this is going to be pulling both panels back together for a Q&A session. We're going to alternate between the virtual questions and our live questions. So at this point, I'll ask the previous panelists to come up to the front here. We'll kind of squeeze in a very COVID careful way. And I'll move to the podium to free up a little more space. Place. All right, it's our last. Thank you all for joining us. I think it's going to be a lot of fun because we've got really a broad, and now Leslie will be happy that we are now breaking down the false dichotomy, and we are talking. This is free for all around any regulatory or perceived risk. So this are liability concerns. So from the virtual space, let's have a question. And because there's so many of you, what I might do is help kind of direct it in a direction so you don't have that awkward 30 seconds of elbowing each other to answer it. Okay, so, and if I get the wrong person, you just sort of defer and we'll move to the next one. What do we hear from the virtual space?
So our first one is, what are some key similarities and differences in addressing liability for a dedicated pregnancy study versus a trial in which people may become pregnant?
Oh, that's a really good one. Who would want that? Actually, I'm going to throw it up to somebody that has thought about this a fair amount. Anna and Leslie, is that something y'all have crossed? This idea of someone becoming pregnant? And if you, Aviva, I know you've run across this.
I mean, the one thing I can think of is, one of the differences is sort of knowing what you're going into to begin with, right? So purposefully designing a study around this more complex population, right? Versus dealing with, a condition that arises during the course of a study, right? So I think that's the distinction. Dealing with it may be similar, but I do think it has significant differences.
Yes, Carmen.
Yes, I'd like to say that from a clinician and from patients' perspectives as well, they are so frustrated when they are part of a trial and inadvertently got pregnant, and then somebody tells them you cannot continue into this trial. And when you look at the whatever treatment or drug or vaccine, you know that that's based on the mechanism of action, it should not present any major risk for this person to continue on that study. And as a person who's doing a trial, it's also very frustrating because you feel that nobody's listening to you, nobody's making an exception of maintaining this person for some time in the trial to get the information.
I think it's really important. That idea of planning ahead and anticipating those things is really great. And I want to compliment the virtual question asker because their question was very short. We're looking for sort of quick answers because we got a lot of people talking. So live, I saw this hand first.
So I just wanted to make a comment and then ask a question. So the comment quickly is, I think many of the people here know this, but there are currently maternal immunization vaccine trials enrolling thousands of people going on right now globally that have gone on, that are currently going on. We'll maybe hear more about those tomorrow, but I would, and we have some experts here in the room, but those companies have solved the liability problems, right, for those trials. So it would be, I think, helpful to learn from those examples. That's just a comment. The question that I have is a bit tangential, but it's something that you referred to, Aviva, and it was around the issue of when a company is trying to bring a drug vaccine to market and they have a wide population. Pregnant individuals are going to slow them down. I mean, that's the perception, and the concern is time to market. Or, I mean, I'm saying it less generously than I could, but it's certainly a concern I've heard in my conversations. So my question is, what is it that could be done to mitigate that? What is it in terms of developing protocols ahead of time, in terms of doing DART studies early, in terms of whatever those things are, so that if you're inclusive, you can be inclusive and yet meet your timelines? How can we think about those issues?
And Aviva wants you to briefly, because I want Catherine and Jeff to weigh in on this as well from their side of the perspective. But we're starting partnerships, so go, Aviva.
So a couple of thoughts. I think that one thing that could be done, right, and this is sort of a complicated answer that has a lot of implications and competitive implications, is to the extent that there's a new class of product or drugs being developed and looked at by multiple companies, right, and you're including pregnant and lactating people in those studies immediately, having some sort of common database that you can see adverse events almost immediately, right, and share that data so you can do much earlier signal detection for that population, right? Because what's really important, it's not getting a drug to market as fast as possible. It's getting a drug to market as safe and efficaciously as possible, right? And certainly the faster you get something to market, the faster you can address a disease state, whatever it may be. And the more complex the trial, the harder that's going to be. The more time you have to take to determine whether a particular adverse event is related to a particularly complex population or something else, the truth is it slows down the entire, right? It may derail the entire program. So those are real considerations. One possible alternative is, a post-market study, right, for that population, right, if you don't do it in the pre-market studies.
So before, I want to hear from you, Leslie, but Jeff or Catherine, any thoughts from that, from this question?
Yeah. I mean, we keep emphasizing this, but I think it's this planning ahead thing. It's before you take the first step. You look at the end game and you say, and to go back to a little more detail about involving, the obstetricians, the MFMs, on the IRBs, on the design committees for the studies, particularly in vaccine trials. We're doing this usually in healthy populations. Particularly serious adverse events are fairly rare in the populations we're studying. Adverse outcomes in pregnancy are pretty common. And having that perspective to know what increase in the rate of missed ABs or preterm labor or whatever else is incredibly important. Someone needs to be there at the beginning to think about how are we going to evaluate when we see these adverse outcomes from the beginning.
Really great point.
I just want to add to that. I just want to add to that in terms of, the opportunity to engage the FDA early in those discussions as well, right? We have a mechanism in the pre-IND phase for discussions about all sorts of those things.
Yeah, and then drawing on Layla and her team and your team and your work as well, Catherine. Leslie, what would you add to that?
I just wanted to push back a little bit on the...
Can you turn your mic on there?
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to push back a little bit on the idea that excluding pregnant people from research necessarily gets a product to market faster. There's a lot of conflicting evidence on whether that's actually the case. Even if it were the case, though, it would still be possible to conduct studies with these populations after a drug goes onto the market, and we don't see industry doing that. We do see some of that in the context of children because there's now a law that actually requires that. Even then, there's still not complete follow through and compliance. But I think that what's really happening, to be a bit crude about it, is that the faster something gets to market, the more money there is for the stakeholders. When we met with all of the lawyers that I mentioned who participated in our consultations, they said and they emphasized that the financial factors can't be taken out of the equation and that we have to be careful not to mistake something as legal when what's actually going on is financial. And so I just wanted to put that out there. Once industry does these studies, the learned intermediary doctrine, where the liability pushes downstream to the physician, begins to evaporate. And it becomes possible for industry to be liable because at that point they have the data And so when they don't have the data, they actually stand in a better liability risk mitigation status than when they do.
Really interesting point. Let's go to a virtual question. So I see you. I'm getting to you. Virtual question.
So someone online is asking, what are some practical approaches that institutions, sponsors, or regulators could take to address liability concerns that impede the inclusion of pregnant and lactating people in trials?
Jessica, you've spent some time. Actually, Jessica, both Jessica and Anna, a lot of the things that you've talked about, as you think about what are, because Anna, you alluded to the fact that you all been at this for years and years and years, and I know, Jessica, this was intentional, right? So what are some things that others, as they start on this journey of doing some of these things, what are the lower hanging fruit around this very, really nice question? Jessica or Anna?
Sure, I'll take a start. But I think, certainly for institutions, I think if the de facto standpoint, as Anna pointed out at UW, is the presumption that you want to do research with these populations and that you have a supportive infrastructure, then you can develop at an institution a supportive infrastructure, policy framework, insurance framework, legal supportive framework to support that entire endeavor. So, I could say, I think that is a model. We work hand in hand. Our legal affairs teams are part of our product development teams, are part of, our ethics committee and office of research, works collaboratively across the institution. I think if there can, if you're starting at that basis of intending and desiring to do research to advance, outcomes and products for these populations, then the supportive infrastructure can be developed.
Nice. Anna?
And I wanted to add something. I actually wanted to emphasize something that Aviva said, which was, lawyers every single day, they do risk management. So they need to be told that this is the priority. They need to be told, and then they can figure out, well, how do we adapt to that? How do we mitigate our risk? And there are different ways of doing that, which we've been discussing. The other thing I wanted to say is it's really important to be talking to people who are doing this research. So other institutions, for example, at the University of Southern California, they have what's known as a flexibility coalition. It was something that when we were doing our research, we had not heard of. Leslie and I had not been aware of. Maybe some of you in the room are aware of it, but it's the institution, the IRB managers all get together and they talk about where there is flexibility within the regulations. And they talk about different approaches to risk, not just for pregnant people, but also for all human subjects research. So there are these opportunities to connect with others who have been working through this. And I certainly would be offering even our IRB manager, because she's been incredibly helpful in spearheading the work that's being done at the university and understands how important it is to work up and down. So it's important to work with not only the senior administrators and the lawyers, but also to work with the researchers, as well as ensuring that you get participant viewpoints as well. So it's throughout the research pathway.
Excellent. I did see your hand first, and I'm sorry for it. So yes, I'd love to hear your question. Yeah. Can you use your mic so that virtual people can hear us as well?
Sorry.
No worries.
I think this is a question for Professor Meltzer. So it seems like, the learned intermediary doctrine I find terrifying as a clinician. And so I'm curious, what is the historical background of that? And then how can we get past that? Because it seems like that might be a big barrier to industry seeking to be part of research with pregnant women, because it's in their best interest to shift that risk downstream to the clinician, right? And so how do we move past that?
So we're freaking out, Leslie. What can we do?
I do not think it's likely that nearly 50 states are going to overturn their tort laws and free you from the learned intermediary doctrine, unfortunately. I think the most fruitful path forward would be to have regulations or statutory requirements similar to what exists in the context of children that require industry to do this work without a requirement to do the work. and have the research in their hands, the learned intermediary doctrine will continue to pass to clinicians. Somewhat ironically, once they do the work, you as a clinician will actually have the information you need to properly inform your patients. So I think it's a win-win for patients and providers. But it isn't necessarily a win for our industry, which could be pulled into these potential liability suits. I think the interesting question for industry then becomes how many of the tort suits that they're facing, that they're swamped with, are actually emanating from currently conducted clinical research with pregnant people. There is a lot of research, and there is a lot of drug approval. But from what we know, most of the litigation is happening after drug approval. It's not happening in the research context. And if that's the case, then we have to really ask ourselves how risky that is for industry and whether they can mitigate.
So the idea is that if we do what we're talking about today, we don't have to worry as much. Is that what I hear you saying? So, Andy, you want to add a point, and we'll go to
I do. I mean, because
virtual.
you also asked about the history. I mean, if you think about it from the broader perspective, the goal, one goal, not the only goal, of the learned intermediary doctrine was not necessarily to protect pharmaceutical companies, but it was to provide the healthcare provider with the opportunity to read the literature and decide how to address the individual needs of that patient, the person who presents in front of them. So it wasn't designed to be some sort of big liability protection, but really designed to offer you your ability to practice what I would call your art.
All right, these are some great questions. Let's go to a virtual question.
So virtual audience wants to know, what are lessons learned from the COVID-19 clinical trials? What should we do differently in the future to include pregnant and lactating people?
Now, we're going to cover a fair amount of that tomorrow. So, virtual person, with your permission, if you promise to come back tomorrow, we're going to cover that in the morning. Because I think that there's a lot of thought that's gone into that session. I'm really excited about it because there's going to be so many lessons learned. So, if you're live, come back tomorrow for sure, because there's going to be a lot happening here in this room. I saw a question there at this table. Yeah.
Yeah, Aaron Pollock, NICHD. A lot of the discussion right now around liability, if I understand it, is focused primarily on drugs for an indication, which would also be used in pregnant and lactating individuals. And maybe this, I think, direct this to Aviva or Leslie. What would the difference in liability be for developing novel therapeutics for obstetric conditions, such as preeclampsia or preterm birth? Would there be a difference in sort of your view of the liability and exposure?
These are some good questions. Leslie, Aviva, who wants to go?
So what comes to mind when you ask that question is similar to development of therapies for cancer patients, right? I think about a complex population, right? So you know what you're getting into, you plan for it, you have all the mitigations in place, and you sort of do the best you can, right? And so you also don't face that, and I did pick up on sort of the negative connotation, but you don't face, right, that idea that you may prevent or delay a product from going to market for a general population, right, without that, inserting that complex population into the calculus.
Leslie, what would you add there?
I think that's an area where we don't have enough evidence in the record, as they would say, to really answer your question fairly. It's, one of the things as a lawyer that we think about in this space is, why weren't the lawyers here sooner, right? And it is entirely natural that we are not the people you necessarily want at the table in the first instance. But there's a real research lag on the law here. And we don't know nearly as much as I wish we did about how the law is operating in these really particular situations, because I think we're coming to it late. We're trying to catch up. But there's just not enough empirical data to answer the question fairly.
That's a really good point. Jeff, did you add something?
We're going to see sooner rather than later a new vaccine indicated for use in the pregnant individual to protect the offspring from disease. That is fundamentally a different thing virtually than FDA's ever done, and I think it's going to raise many new sort of legal liability questions, and I think we're going to see a lot of this worked out as we see those products come to market and sort of be tested in the marketplace.
Go ahead.
Sorry, just one thing that raises, and I think she might not be here now. Oh, Dr. Karen had mentioned, and sorry, right as you're walking out, that wasn't fair. Maternal immunization you raised, and the reason I think it actually dovetails so nicely with this question is because there is research happening in this area. And one of the reasons, arguably, that this work is happening is because there's benefit to the fetus. And so the question is that actually an easier place to do the research, given how Subpart B is written, than other aspects that might not be pregnancy specific? And I'll put that out there for conversation, because I know we're running short on time.
Can I just ask a question about that, a follow-on? I mean, if the mother isn't healthy, how can the fetus be healthy? So why does it just have to be about benefit to the fetus?
Right. Well, and I think
or the infant.
Products will be licensed for use to prevent disease in the infant, and there won't be any requirement from the FDA to show any benefit in the mother. So it will be for use in this individual to benefit another individual. This is going to be, it's going to be dramatically different.
But I was, sorry, and because you called on me, but I was asking a different question, Jeff, which was, yes, agreed that it's an interesting, paradigm shift. But if you don't have a healthy mother, why do we have that dichotomy? Why does it make it easier because it's going to benefit the fetus? If the mother isn't healthy, then the baby won't be healthy is I guess the point. But I came in the middle of the conversation.
Love this topic. We're going to move it to the coffee break. And so anybody who wants to talk about.
But Leslie left us at the end of her session with that elephant in the room. Yes. I think, I'm sorry, but I think I can't be the only person.
We are doing great on time. We got about 10 minutes left. We do want to go to a virtual question. Because you are my boss in this planning committee, I will absolutely defer, and we will now we're going to take a few minutes, Leslie, for you to sort of expose the elephant.
Okay.
That's a big thing.
Right. So just in the few weeks since Justice Alito's potential majority opinion for the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade has come out, a number of states have amplified their efforts to pass so-called personhood statutes, among other things. And a number of states, mostly in the Midwest and in the South, already had these statutes on the books. There's no evidence to date that any of these statutes have been used in or to prevent research with pregnant or lactating people. Really, it's pregnant people who would be of concern in this context. But I think there is a adjacent precedent, one might say, that worries me. And that is that there are already hundreds of cases across the country of pregnant people who have been prosecuted for child abuse, child neglect, and the like, for engaging in things like not taking their doctor's orders seriously, that they need bed rest, and suffering a miscarriage or worse, right? Later in a pregnancy, perhaps. So there is a lot of concern, I think, to be had about the misuse of these rules. But I also think it further complicates the already ambiguous nature of Subpart B. Particularly with regard to the father's role in consent. Right now it is a smaller role, and that's because that was written when Roe v. Wade is still briefly the law. And that could change, I think, quite significantly.
Leslie, you can have the floor for keep going. There's some.
I haven't depressed everyone.
No, I think it's important context for us to think. I mean, there's things that good. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a real twist.
Yeah.
It is a real twist.
It's a real twist. first started planning this workshop.
Yeah. What Ruth was talking about was the fact that this is a twist that has come up even since we started planning this workshop. And so spending some time with the group's permission, spending a little bit of time sort of weighing through this. And for those of you who had some questions, our panelists will be, everyone staying for the coffee half hour? Perfect. So please engage, and our virtual folks will love to hear from you, continue. Because I do think that, Ruth, I think your point is well taken, that this is a real twist. And there obviously may be other thoughts that the other panelists have in addition to Leslie. So
I can just throw out two more things. I have nightmares about this that keep me up. One of them is the possibility that there will be a guardian ad litem appointed, right, to the fetus who determines under Subpart B, some new version of Subpart B, whether this research can take place. I don't think that is entirely crazy. The second part of that, though, is if we start thinking like law professors do when they write exams like this, all the parade of horribles that might potentially happen that could work against what we're all fighting for. One of the things that occurs to me is there are a handful of states, fewer than a dozen. Maryland happens to be one of them, where regardless of what happens with the Supreme Court opinion, the fetus remains a fetus. There will not be a personhood law. There is a right to an abortion in that state, and so things like fetal personhood will not take place. Maryland is also unique in that it's one of only a very small number of states that has its own human subjects research regulations. So what I think we might see in the future is more states who make this connection, who pass their own human subjects research regulations. Maybe there is a future in which there are Subpart Bs at the state level.
Anna's got to talk about this. Go, Anna.
Well, it's the fetal personhood side. I mean, I think what Leslie is saying, I completely agree with you. And yes, you and I do not sleep enough, for sure, especially after that opinion was issued. I guess the point I wanted to raise is that maybe we'll end up in a space where the research is only being conducted in certain states, just to take it a step further. So versus Louisiana or some of the other more conservative states that will, and some of them already do, recognize essentially personhood at the time of fertilization. So, maybe we're going to have different venues than we had originally anticipated for doing research with pregnant and lactating people.
I love that you took it in that place because with single IRB rules now also becoming more popular, if we're going to be optimistic, if the world does go in that direction, you could imagine a specialized IRB, right, that actually engages in reviewing this kind of research. So perhaps there are states that become friendly places to do this research. We know from our consultations with general counsel at various pharmaceutical companies that they know which academic centers they can do this research at. And it may not be too far a stretch to say they'll know which states and which IRBs they can do this research with.
Go ahead.
So, just in raising that point, I think as a point of concern, then we wonder about the representation of people in trials, right? Whether the data will be applicable to everyone.
Absolutely.
Ruth, did you want to make a point? Can you use your mic?
So I just wanted to connect a little bit the ethics gap between Jeff, what you were saying, and where this could go. So Jeff, you were raising this sort of twist on a paradigm where we would be doing research with pregnant women for the benefit. We are doing research with pregnant women in the context of maternal immunization for the benefit of their babies. Now, you could say the interests of the pregnant woman and her baby are so totally aligned that even though technically she's not a prospect of direct medical benefit to her, there's obviously tremendous benefit to pregnant people that their babies, when they're born, will be less likely to succumb or become seriously ill with this condition. But you're talking about two separate entities when you're working through this from an ethics point of view. We've worked forever, right, in this space, and it's something Maggie alluded to earlier, to try to break down and sort of say that in almost all cases, the interests align between the pregnant person and the baby that will be born in research and in clinical practice, right? It's the point that Ruth was making about, what's the point of, if you have an unhealthy mother, what are the prospects for the baby? If we end up in a dynamic in which fetuses are given full legal personhood in any number of jurisdictions, you're going to have two separate, right, entities, right? And you're going to flip this, and the question will be, right, will that even further break down, right, what we have worked so hard to develop in this area, which is this is not a competing context between two sets of interests. It's actually an aligned set of interests. But the way the law might go in a lot of states will be to take us back, right, to a dynamic in which the baby, now understood to be from the time of conception, an independent entity, and then you're into, is the right analogy the pediatric regs? And, there have been some cases in which kids have been enrolled in studies for benefit of other family members. Is that where we're going to have to go? I just throw this out here and talk about, tummy aches and other things.
Let's have one comment on this, and that'll be our coffee break teaser. Carmen, what would you say to Ruth's comments?
As an obstetrician, I'm really concerned because it's going back to the time when women with HIV needed paternal consent for even participating in a study that would benefit themselves as well as their pregnancy. I think if we get to that point where the unborn fetus has the rights of a born person, it might be to the detriment of pregnant persons who might end up prolonging pregnancies, not receiving treatments, or receiving not the best treatments just because you're trying to protect this unborn person. So it's an area of concern, and we'll have to wait and see. But again, we need to be hopeful and keep looking for strategies to improve both the health of mothers and their infants.
Really, what a great discussion. Let's hear it for our panelists. So in our time, we discussed across both of these as we think about regulatory and liability issues, being proactive as we're planning, doing these things, the importance of partnerships that not operating in our silos, addressing these issues a priority, and then finally the last little bit, the curveball is prepare for paradigm shifts. So that is what we're about for the next 30 minutes for our coffee hour. Really, again, I want to thank everybody. This has been an outstanding conversation and look forward to great dialogue as we continue.